afternoon, my Realtors family. We welcome you to our Hour of Power. And, on behalf of CAREB, on behalf of our president, Rhea Cotton Landry, we want to thank all of you for being here. And we have an exceptional, special guest. But I'm going to have my partner in crime. Oh, by the way, you guys, my name is Wabette Johansson. I forgot that part. I'm your third VP of education here at CAREB. But you guys, I have a remarkable partner in crime on this committee. And whenever I need anybody to present, Mike, like I said, you just every single time throw out the park. So today, you guys, we have a special guest. And I'm going to bring on Mike to introduce our Hour of the Power speaker for today, Mr. Mike.
I just know how to blackmail a lot of people. That's all it is, man. I've got too many secrets on these guys. No, I'm kidding. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for setting everything up today. My name is Mike Shankman. I am one of the directors here at CAREB, and it is my pleasure to introduce the speaker that we have today. His name is Jordan Levine. He is the Senior Vice President and Chief Economist at the California Association of Realtors. He is responsible for economic and housing market research, as well as policy analysis for CAR's legislative and advocacy efforts. He has his bachelor's in business economics from UC Santa Barbara and a master's degree with merit in international economics from the University of Sussex in London. Now, here's the important part, though. Jordan is a California native who grew up here in San Diego, my town right now. He's actually El Cajon, right, Jordan?
Lakeside, yep.
Lakeside, so he's an East County boy. That's how we do this here, right? He has lived all over the state, though. Currently, he lives on the Central Coast with his two great kids that he enjoys camping, walking on the beach, going down to Dog Beach, taking long walks on the beach, ladies. And he is evangelizing for his e-bikes. His work has relied upon boasted by realtors, consumers, business leaders, and policymakers alike. He's regularly featured in our local and national media. On a different note, I will know that I like to think I know Jordan personally. He is a great individual. He is very passionate about the work that he does, and he's extremely knowledgeable in everything, especially with all the stuff we're dealing with and all the very certain things we're dealing with right now. So it's with great pleasure and honor I'd like to introduce Jordan Levine.
Wow. Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you for that great introduction. Yeah, it's a terrible time to be a forecaster. And I said, these things are kind of dying on the vine faster than we can even put the forecasts out. And there's a lot of uncertainty. But I think even with all of the kind of crazy stuff that's going on out there, there is some stuff that we do know. I think there's stuff that the consumers need to know in particular. And so that's kind of my mantra is like, anybody that tells you they know exactly what the next 12 to 18 months is going to look like, I think is lying to you, candidly. But we can kind of take what we know and what the results of all this uncertainty will be to kind of connect some dots, I think, for consumers because they're hyper focused on current events, right? We're reading the newspaper, we're hearing about tariffs, we're seeing the stock market jumping all over the place, and people have a lot of questions. We've had buyers that not just for the last 2-3 months, but for the last 2-3 years have been like sitting on the sidelines thinking that some magical best time to buy was going to be right around the corner when rates plunge again and foreclosures come down the pike and prices fall or something like. And none of that's actually happened, right? And meanwhile, all these folks have missed out on great opportunities to get into home ownership as prices have really continued to go up. But when you think about the kind of policy environment, and again, we don't know exactly where all the policy stuff is going to land. Every day it's a new thing, it seems like. But I think when you think about it from the standpoint of California, from a housing standpoint, the nuts and bolts, I think they want to just keep the current tax code going. That's like priority number one, is to not have taxes go up on folks. Problem being is that those tax cuts that we put in back in 2017 to keep them going costs about $3.5 trillion. So it's a big, expensive price tag. That's one of the reasons why 10-year treasuries and 30-year fixed rate mortgage have not improved despite the cuts that we've had from the Federal Reserve. Initially, we were hoping that we would extend the tax cuts and get some of the stuff that we lost during the last round of of tax reform that was particularly impactful in California. Namely, we lost our ability to deduct all of our state and local taxes that got capped at $10,000. And many people pay more than $10,000 just in property tax. Forget about income tax and all the other stuff that we send to Sacramento. And we were hopeful that we would get that stuff restored, right? So that we got that deductibility back and would help those homeowners that have property taxes that are no longer able to deduct those, those items off their taxes. That's less likely. The other one I think that's a lot less likely is capital gains. One of the things that we saw, back in 1997 when we passed the homeowner capital gains exemption was that $500,000 seemed like a lot of money at that time, right? Now we're 30-ish years down the road, and many long-term homeowners, through no fault of their own, have seen their homes, appreciate beyond that exemption, and that has a big price tag to doubling that to $1 million, where it would have been had we, initially indexed it to inflation. And so not going to get some of those wish list items when it comes to tax policy that we were hoping would really come in and kind of help with housing supply in particular, right? Those long-term homeowners don't want to move because of these capital gains. That's further depressing active housing inventory for us to be able to sell out there. The other piece on the policy front is that probably going to have slower economic growth, right? That unfortunately, over the short run, we're not able to just substitute away from a lot of these imported goods. Things like lumber that we get from Canada, things like gypsum and drywall that we get from Mexico, things like parts for automobiles that we get from China and other parts of East Asia. And we're already seeing the effects of that on short run economic growth, right? Rebuilding your manufacturing base is a, laudable goal, arguably, but that's a long-term goal, right? It takes a long time to get those factories back online and bring all the jobs home. And that's in a best case scenario, right? So over the short run, it just means paying more for the stuff that we can't get away from. And you're seeing the impacts of that on economic growth. Also in the stock market, particularly those stocks that are susceptible to a global economic supply chain, right? And so there's going to be less growth. There's also the potential that it's going to make inflation persist that much longer, right? When you talk about a tariff, it really means just upping the price of the stuff you're bringing in, 25% for autos, steel, stuff like that, hundreds of percent on specific countries, right? That just means, again, that this inflation environment, which is the thing that the Fed's totally keyed in on, right? Crushing inflation, is just going to be that much harder to get under wraps. And that's before we consider the kind of labor market impacts of cracking down on immigration and a 4%, unemployment economy, and the inflationary impacts of that kind of long-term deficit and debt spending. And so again, we don't know exactly what the next thing is going to be on the policy agenda, but I think when you take it all together, it just means that the Fed's going to be hard pressed to deliver on those rate cuts that everybody is really dying to see more of, right? This is what the econ nerds call stagflation, right? If you have less growth but still have inflationary pressures, that puts the Fed in a real bind, right? Because the Fed has really one weapon in its arsenal for doing anything, right? To make the economy better or worse, it can either raise or lower the interest rate. Normally, that's a pretty effective weapon because inflation and the economy are typically tied, right? You have an inflation an economy that's growing like crazy. That creates all this inflation. They raise the rates, it dials the economy back. You take away some of that inflation, but if you get into a stagflation type of situation where you have unemployment that's rising, but you still have the inflation, then it becomes difficult for the Fed to decide what to do, right? Because they have to choose between attacking the unemployment or attacking the inflation, because there's only that one weapon. If they want to go after the inflation and keep the rates high, then unemployment gets worse. They could lower the rate to fix the unemployment situation, but then inflation gets worse. And so they're, between a kind of rock and a hard place there. And I think ultimately, if you look at the tail of the tape over the last 2 to 3 years, the Fed cares most about inflation. I think they'll allow a little bit of unemployment in order to make sure that inflation is fully stamped out. And the translation on that means that they're just not going to be able to deliver on all those rate cuts that we want. Your brother-in-law's like 4.5%, 5% mortgage rate that he keeps telling you is right around the corner is probably not going to be able to materialize in an environment like this, right? And so you don't want to be waiting around for interest rates, especially as prices keep going up. Just to kind of hammer that home and make sure we're looking at it in terms of pictures and not just words, this is the inflation stuff, right? This is the consumer price index. We're still at 2.5% for headline. We're still at almost 3% for core inflation. And with the tariffs coming in and the labor market that's still tight, I think it's going to be difficult to get this last mile done on inflation, right? When you think about what are the current sources of inflation, goods inflation has largely been conquered, right? During the pandemic, we had a lot of shortages. Factories were shut down. We didn't have toilet paper at Costco, and all this crazy stuff was happening out there. Since we reopened, goods inflation, and you can see that on the left-hand side, durables and non-durables, that just means stuff, right? It's physical things that we buy. Inflation there has largely been conquered. It's service sector where we've got a huge shortage of minimum wage workers, largely because of the cost of daycare. And that's like a whole nother speech that we could talk about, but really depressing labor force at the bottom end of the wage spectrum, pushing up wages, right? We had a lot of early retirees as well. And so just labor force in general is still pretty depressed. And of course, housing costs are still high, right? And so those things take a while to get under control. Shortages, shortage driven inflation goes away immediately. You put toilet paper back at Costco, prices come down, right? But that's not the case for the labor market and the service sector, for housing costs. And then you layer on the tariff environment, right? And that just means that this goods inflation, which we had largely conquered after the pandemic, may start ramping back up, right? And so again, all of this, kind of boring macroeconomic data, just, and again, even with all the caveats and asterisks for uncertainty, none of the scenarios point to a dramatic decline in mortgage interest rates, right? That's the kind of bottom line on all of this stuff. The one kind of, caveat to that is if the economy plunges, right? This is the problem with macroeconomic forecasting, is that people aren't updating their forecasts every single day, right? I put mine out every quarter, a couple times a year. People do it monthly, right? But stuff's happening every single day. The Atlanta Fed has a really cool tool called the GDP Now. And what it does is it just takes every new piece of data that comes out that actually feeds into GDP and just feeds it into a very basic algorithm that tells us how is GDP tracking every day as a new piece of data comes out. So this is a chart of all of the estimates for the first quarter of the year as they've evolved over time. So you go back to Christmas time, most forecasts were expecting that the economy would grow at 2.5%. That really remained the case right up until February, when we started seeing this volatility in the financial markets and the trade war really ramping up. And you can see that every new piece of data that's come out since late February has pushed the estimate for first quarter economic growth first into negligible growth and now firmly into negative territory, right? So the nowcast currently has us shrinking by 2.4%. And that's, again, just a symptomatic of us suffering from the inflationary effects of the short run, right? You can't just get car parts from somewhere else immediately. We're paying more for those on the lots, right? Or for in production. The new cars are going to start costing more. And that has taken a bite out of growth because we're subtracting off imports when we go through and calculate economic growth, right? We add up all the economic activity, but then we subtract off the part that's us stimulating the economies of the rest of the world. And so when imports go up, it takes a bite out of overall GDP growth, but it, doesn't really solve the labor force shortage, which has improved, but you can see we still have too many jobs, not enough people to fill them. And so not only do we have this kind of goods inflation ramping back up, but those underlying sources of homegrown inflation remain in place, right? And so it's hard to lure somebody away from their job, and we don't have a ton of unemployed workers just sitting on the sidelines. So for me to get a new analyst, I've got to go steal them from, Goldman Sachs or something like that. I got to pay them more money. And that's like the result of these labor shortages, and why, again, I think that these forecasts of super low mortgage interest rates are far-fetched. If you start drilling under the surface of these macroeconomic numbers, it doesn't support massive rate cuts coming down the pike from the Fed. If you look at overall economic data, almost every data point's at an all-time high level. Right? Actually, let me back up. This is $25.1 trillion that we generated in personal income last year. Most income generated by any economy ever, pretty much doing really good. But when you look at regular people, this kind of tale of two economies is starting to emerge, right? Where you've got some folks at the high end of the income spectrum who are doing better than ever financially. And then the median household and median, wage earner, in contrast, still is barely back to where they were before the pandemic, once you factor in the rising cost of everything we got to do with these wages, right? And so, we're going to face ongoing challenges, and why I think even as we've been on the uptrend in real estate here in California, we've got our work cut out for us because our clients are really up against it financially too. You can see in the retail sales numbers that this inflation is going to take a toll, and the tariffs and everything else on our main engine of growth. Almost all of that income that we took in, we spent. You can see retail sales numbers are at an all-time high level, and we're increasingly having to put that spending on the credit card. If you go back to the pit during the pandemic to where we are now, we've added, 400 billion dollars, in new credit card debt, which is increasingly becoming delinquent, right? And if you look at auto loans as well, back at the start of the pandemic, we had about 1.2 trillion dollars of auto loans. Now we have about 1.6 trillion dollars of auto loans. So you add both of those up, but it's about $1 trillion of new consumer debt, which is also increasingly becoming delinquent. So, we've got some red flags out there on the economic front. The stock market is, not the least of the issues. We were already up at 30 or 44, 45,000 on the Dow a few months ago, right? And that's already down to 38,000. It was back up at 39 this morning, but that's a 15% correction already. And unfortunately, if you look at where, those valuations are still relative to earnings, I think there's still some downside risk on the stock market. This is a 150 plus year history on S&P 500 market cap compared to S&P 500 earnings. And you can see that it's, you're hard pressed to find times when the stock market's as overvalued as it is right now. You're talking about, dot-com bubble at the end of 1999 and like Black Friday right before the Great Depression. We're normally at a 13 times earnings. We're currently in the 30s still. And you never know if I knew what the stock market was going to do, I wouldn't even be here, right? But this is a vulnerability that if the unknown does happen, right, to get back to that top end of the normal range, the stock market on top of the 15% we already saw would have to do another 40% just to get back down to the high side of the range. And to get back to normal, it would be, a further reduction of more than half on the stock market. Office market too is still having a lot of challenges. And I'm sorry, I haven't been paying attention to the chat. Should I look and see if there's any questions? What about middle jobs, not analysts and high wage earners? Yeah, I think I got to that a little bit. Did I answer your question a bit?
And the funny because it says why that, but that's not me. I think that's somebody that was on one of my other Zooms that has my name.
No, that's okay. I think I did.
So
I'm
not sure who that is.
Yeah, you got people under your name, Javette?
Right, exactly. Okay, well, that's not me. Go.
No, I have my chat up now, though, so I will pay attention. If you guys have more questions, just stop me and we can dig in. But one of the things that I think could be one of those challenges is office market. You can see that because remote work is still a thing, because the labor market is still so tight, people haven't been able to get everybody back to the office, and they're not consuming as much office space, meaning that vacancy rates are high. There's also no such thing as a 30-year fixed rate office loan. And so even people that want to keep their office, they got to go out and re-up that debt that they took out at 3%. Now it's 7, 8, 9, 10 plus percent. And that combined with these high office vacancies, and by the way, it's not just in LA and San Francisco, right? Even in Austin, Texas, New York, other places, big cities, you're seeing these big office vacancies across the map. And that's actually leading to increasing office mortgage delinquency. This is delinquencies, and to a lesser extent multifamily, but at least the multifamily, what they have going for them is 90+% occupancy. Office space, not the case, right? Big vacancy rates in office. And even with 4 or 5% unemployment, basically a full employment, all-time high economy, we have worse office mortgage delinquency now than we did after the 2008 financial crisis. And that's with everything still going good, right? So this is one of those wild cards, I think, that we've got to worry about, and why I think ultimately it just means even with all the uncertainty, you don't want to be waiting for mortgage rates. And I think residential real estate is a smart bet in an environment where all these other big drivers, it's REBA in 2025 to 35 won't work. No, I unfortunately do not think affordability is, and that's one of the reasons why I say don't wait for rates, right? Is because I don't think your incomes are going to be able to catch up with the prices and the rent growth, right? Even with all the turbulence in the economy, prices are still going up. Rates doubled faster than ever in recorded history, and prices just kept going up the whole time. We have a housing shortage. That's what's making housing unaffordable, and that's why you don't wait around for interest rates. You buy as soon as you can and then refi if rates ever go down in the future, because you can always take advantage of a low rate, right? When they go down, you can never take the time machine back 15 years ago and pay the cheaper price. And that's like the part you miss out on when you're hyper focused on, the latest newspaper headline. Mike, did you want to jump in on that?
Well, no, I have a different question. So I was trying to get in here when you were talking about the office space. I had read a report recently that was in, I think it was in CoStar News, that talked about just recently that there was a massive increase in office occupancy now, that it was reversing it, albeit slightly. Are you seeing that same trend based on a lot of the return to work orders on the federal side and all that? Are you seeing that?
Tiny bit. So you don't want to pop the champagne corks right now, but if you look at this chart, I don't know if you can see it or not, but there's like some signs that office vacancy is topping out in the 35% range. So it's like, I don't know if it's improving. It's just that we maybe have arrested the decline, or it's like finding bottom. But yeah, I think normal. It's going to take a recession for, employers to get the upper hand again and force those folks back to the office, I think. But we're probably finding bottom. I don't know if it's going to be a huge, sore spot. And the other point I will make on this is that we learned a lot of lessons in 2008, where they're not going to just let these loans go belly up the way that we did, right? And throw homeowners to the wolves like we did back then. I think there'll be some haircuts, there'll be some good deals out there. And I think that, combined with workers being more hungry for jobs in a kind of potential recession, then, that could help us stave off a worst case scenario. But I think, even as we still are optimistic and our forecast is, those are the things we need to be, vigilant on, because those are the things the clients are going to be worried about, and maybe the things that they're misinterpreting as a reason to like wait for a cheap rate in the future or something like that. When you think about where rates are and where they're headed, it's really hard to see rates dropping below 6%. This is the Fed funds rate, which is still top end of the range, is 4.5%, which puts it basically right on top of the 10-year treasury. If you look at the Fed's guidance, they told us maybe 2 rate cuts this year, maybe taking it down to 4, maybe even 3.5, absolute best case scenario. That doesn't leave a lot of room for the orange line, which is the 10-year treasury. And that's the one that really matters for mortgage rates. We as regular people don't get to borrow at the Fed funds rate, right? You got to be a bank with billions of dollars of assets and borrowing for only 1 day to borrow at the blue line. And actually, by the way, we don't even get to borrow at the orange line. That's the risk-free time value of money if you're loaning it to the government, not to a regular person who could walk off the curb and get hit by a bus or something like that. So, there's not a lot of room for the 10-year to improve, even if we get all the rate cuts that the Fed is telling us they're going to get. And by the way, we don't even, again, get to borrow at the orange. That's kind of the blue is like the basement. The orange is the floor, right? That's the time value of money. But really, you got to add on private sector risk, and the econ nerds call that mortgage rate spreads. That's how much higher mortgages are above that 10-year. Usually that's 170 basis points because of all the deficit spending, because of quantitative tightening by the Fed, where they're, selling off their mortgage-backed security portfolio and all of that. Those are now in the 250 basis point range, and there's not a lot of optimism for those going back to what we used to think was normal. All of this just to say that even in very optimistic assumptions about where the bond market can go, where those private sector spreads can go, and what the Fed told us explicitly they're going to do, to me, I see 6% as the floor, right? So just this idea of waiting for rates, I think, is not backed up by the trends, by basic, kind of logic. And indeed, if you look at the tail of the tape on mortgage rates, this, unfortunately, I said this one looks exactly like my weight loss journey, right? There's been some ups, some downs. But more or less, if you look back over the last 2.5, 3 years, like nothing has really happened for all intents and purposes, right? Like everyone's been waiting for rates. And meanwhile, prices have continued to rise. And even if none of the crazy stuff happens, it's just because we have a housing shortage. And I think this gets to Reba's question about whether affordability will improve. And my honest forecast is no, it won't, because when you go back to the 1970s, we used to build 300,000 homes a year. We built 2.2 million homes in the 1970s, and we were a 20 million person state. In our heyday of building in the modern era, 2000 to 2009, we built 1.4 million units, and we were a 40 million person state. We built 800,000 fewer homes during our absolute housing boom when we were twice as big as we did back in the 1970s. And that's why, affordability is bad. We are 12% of the economy, or the 12% of the US population, but the best we've ever done is 10% of the US residential construction. And so that giant sucking sound, taking all your friends and relatives out to Texas and Nevada and Arizona and Mississippi and all these places across the South, right? You explain that by this, right? We just don't, it's too expensive to live here. And Reba's right, $35 an hour doesn't cut it here. As crazy as that sounds, you can draw a straight line from that comment to this chart, right? That when you have this booming economy and you don't build enough housing, you commoditize the housing market. We've turned homes in California into a Taylor Swift concert, right? You got 10,000 seats in the arena with 50,000 screaming teenage girls out front. And that's why you got those dudes standing out on the curb selling the tickets for 3, 4, 5 times face value, right? It's a simple, this isn't econometrics, it's basic arithmetic, right? And again, it all stems from this chart. And that's why, unfortunately, I'm pessimistic about $35 an hour being able to cut it in the near future, right? Is because if you look at the tail end of this chart, how are we doing on new construction? Are we getting there? Are we getting better? Are we getting worse? And we're getting farther away from the goal, not closer. We're not closing that gap. The gap's getting worse. Why all these employers and workers are relocating to other areas. We're 2 million units shy easily, right? That's just to tread water. That's just to make the minimum payment on the credit card. Forget about chipping away at the principal balance, right? If we would have been 12%, and you add up this light blue stuff, you get a couple million units right off the bat just to tread water on affordability, right? This is why you buy as soon as you can, and why over the long term prices in California have only ever gone one way. And actually why, and that's without even lumping on the insurance challenges. I don't know how much time I've been talking. Am I going too long? But insurance is only getting worse too. And why, even with all of those issues, right? We saw the interest rate chart, which has more or less been a straight line for the last 3 years. Look at the home price chart. Definitely not a straight line, right? Even as interest rates doubled, those prices barely pause to take a breather. We're probably going to bust through the $900,000 annual median price point this year in California. We'll probably be $1 million median price state by the time we get to the end of the decade. And when you put that higher price together with the same exact monthly mortgage payment, or excuse me, with the same exact interest rate, you get a higher monthly mortgage payment, right? The monthly mortgage payment's up $1,500 a month just over the last couple of years, even though rates, haven't changed that much. And that's because of that housing shortage. That's why we now have a huge gap with the rest of the United States when it comes to housing affordability. 15% of Californians at the end of last year could afford the median priced home in California. That compares to over a third nationwide, but it's also the lowest that we've seen since the 2008, housing bubble, 2006, 7, lowest points that we've seen. When you carve it up by demographic, and this is why I love working for CAR, like we need to be out there advocating for home ownership more than ever, right? Those gaps are persistent and growing. And that's true even within our state. Oh, and I see Ann has a question here. Sorry. Are you seeing stability in the broker line of credit world? Credit across the board is tough for all, right? I think lines of credit are expensive. Assumable loans, super valuable. Absolutely. Unfortunately, not a lot of loans are assumable. Those VA assumable loans are great. You got to find somebody that's a veteran that can assume it, right? FHA is amazing. And I think you can do that and take out a second for the overage. That's like how really creative realtors are going to be knocking it out of the park. You're going to need to bring all that bag of tricks. Randy, did you have a question?
Yes. So my question was, or how the impact on the rental market. So I've seen now a number of owners that are, due to a lot of things that you're talking about over the last several years, get into a difficult time because of debt, and now needing to be able to potentially sell, with not a whole lot of equity. And so, on the flip side, then I have had some homeowners or some potential buyers ready to get out of the market because they really want to have more of an equilibrium in regards to the mortgage payment due to the rent. So now, because your normal average mortgage payment is about $5,000 for a three-bedroom house, 3-bedroom, 2-bath house, and rent, you're probably only going to get about $3,000, 3,200. So how do you see the impact as it pertains to mortgage balancing with the rental market?
I think you're going to see rents continue to go up. That's one of the kind of weird, bizarre kind of ways that this stuff's all connected, is that the worse ownership affordability drops, the more people are forced into the rental market. And that just, ends up pumping up the rental market. And you get all these high income, would-be homeowners that end up renting and just pushing up market rents even further than they are. And you end up just falling further and further behind. I think, part of it's there is a differential on rent and ownership and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, of 30 years, you got something to show for it. And that is something that I think renters forget, right? Is that there's some kind of asset at the end of the rainbow, right? And also there's the kind of price appreciation component, right? Like I'm looking at that housing shortage and thinking, man, we're going to look back and think $1 million were the good old days, right? When stuff was cheap. And as crazy as that sounds, I think that's why it might not be your dream home on the first go round, right? It might be something small. It might be something a little dusty. It might be something that you got to like use your imagination on, right? And use as a stepping stone into that next thing. But I think, there's that kind of dual purpose component where it's the place you live, but it's also an investment, right? If you go rent somewhere that's going to be cheaper and then buy some Bitcoin, like, right, you can't just, that's like, you can't live in your Bitcoin. You still are paying rent on top of that too. So like when you're thinking about getting ahead in life, like that's why housing is a long-term game and it's not just a kind of arbitrage thing. But I do think that the less housing we build and the more prices rise and the less people that can afford home ownership, then the higher and higher rents go, right? That's why rents are 3,500 bucks. And as crazy as they are is because, you know, you got all these people that make 100 grand, and 100 grand doesn't get you into a house anymore. And so they're out there pushing up the prices of all these apartments, right? And it's all, unfortunately, all connected. And when you think about like your opportunity to come in and swoop up a foreclosure, this is not 2008 all over again, right? You got people that are really holding on to their homes for dear life because they're in the lowest interest rates of all time. Even if I lose my job, I'm going to do everything I can to keep that mortgage going because it's at 3%, right? Like maybe buying a house at today's rates is worse than an apartment rent, but the payment on my house that I have at 2.85% is better than a rent. So even in a worst case scenario, I'm not walking away from that house. And indeed, you can see 98% of Californians are still paying their mortgage payment on time, not just because they got a low payment and they're, you know, 95% of people are still employed, obviously, with our super low unemployment rates, but also these people are all sitting on a lot of home equity, right? So even if you do lose your job, you don't throw the keys back to the bank on a house that you could just sell for more than you owe on the mortgage. You sell it, right? You put it on the MLS, you dump it, you put that money in the bank and bridge through till you get a job, go rent something, etc. So there's not going to be a bunch of foreclosures coming in to save the day on inventory. And, you know, ultimately that's been the kind of limiting factor, and why even as we're up off the bottom from where we were at the end of 2022, it's been a painfully slow, you know, rebuilding. And you can see what a long way off that norm, even, you know, pre-pandemic is. And actually all of this uncertainty is just pushing the recovery that much further out. I'm looking at this question. Sorry, that's all great for investors, but building costs are high and credit is harder to get. High income renters, though. Yeah. So, yeah, I think we're in agreement, but let me know. Happy to dig deeper on that. But you can see how much the uncertainty and the fires and all of that stuff has taken a lot of the momentum out of the last couple of months in terms of transaction growth. We were recovering pretty solidly, and then now that's kind of petered out with all of the trade war and everything else ramping up. This just shows you how correlated high-end home sales are to the stock market. When the orange line is up, 2 million, 3 million, 5 million home sales are up even more. And when they're down, those sales are down even more. So this is, again, a huge source of volatility, and why I think we've had to downgrade our forecast. I think we got to remind buyers, again, that it's a long-term game and that rates right now are actually normal. The 3% rates of back in the day were the thing that was the anomaly, right? I wish I had like a Men in Black, like I could use my clicker and hold it up and you could look at the end of the pen and forget that there was ever like a 3% mortgage interest rate, because really, you know, we're basically right on top of the historic average over the last 40 years of where mortgage rates have been. And people may not realize it, but when they're rooting for another 3% mortgage rate, they're really rooting for themselves to lose their job or be fired, right? Because the only time you ever really see sustained sub 6% mortgage interest rates is when an economic catastrophe has materialized, right? It's really only been when there's been terrible economic conditions, and that's not good for you as a borrower, right? When 20 million people lose their job and the stock market gets cut in half, then that's not clear to me that that's a net positive for you. You maybe were one of the, you know, lucky few to escape unscathed during the pandemic, but there's no guarantee that the next flavor of crisis is going to be the one where you're so lucky. And so actually, again, rates right now are normal, and unlike those renters who may say it's cheaper to rent, right? They aren't looking at this chart, which shows you that the one and only way anybody's ever accumulated wealth in this country is by buying their own home. Simple as that. If I knew a high income renter and I was a realtor, I would print off this chart and I would show it to him and I would say, do you want to be blue or do you want to be yellow? Because really it's as simple as that. You can try and get fancy with it and time the market and subscribe to your brother-in-law's email newsletter and do all this fancy stuff with Bitcoin and all that. This chart shows you that that's a failing strategy, that that does not work, and that when you rent and try and do all this other stuff, you don't make any money and get any better off, and your kids are just as poor as you were. And when you buy your own house, your kids end up doing better than you, right? It's really that's why you don't try and time the market. You buy as soon as you can, especially in a chronically undersupplied market like California, and then you ride that long-term wave, and you reap the benefits. You actually have more options now, and I think from a realtor transaction standpoint, one of the main reasons why we're still optimistic, even with all this uncertainty, is that we're getting more listings, right? We have more inventory now than we've had at any point in the last 5 years. But I just want to manage your expectations that it's not going to be a cruise control environment, because we've still got 2/3 of California homeowners out there, the orange and below. That's the percentage of homeowners in California with a sub 4% mortgage. So, those people really don't want to move. They want to keep that mortgage if they can, unless they've had a bunch of babies or their wife cheated on them and moved in with their boyfriend or did some crazy stuff, which does happen, and why we are seeing people move. Tight inventory is going to be the name of the game moving forward. It's probably going to be stuck around 3 months supply. In fact, if you look at new supply, this is how much is going on to the MLS. That's kind of petered out already. So even though we're at a 5-year high now, right, we're probably not looking to go much higher than that for the balance of the year, which is why actually buyers need to know the market's getting more competitive, not less. Homes are selling in 20 days compared to 43 earlier this year. More homes are now closing above list price. You're talking about 2 out of 5 compared to less than a third at the beginning of the year. So again, these are all things that the longer you wait, the more those prices go up, the less interest rates change, and the more other buyers you've got to claw your way past on what is still going to be a pretty constrained inventory. So are rates going to come down over the next couple of years? Yeah, probably. Are they going to come down enough that would make it worth waiting on the sidelines while prices continue to rise? Absolutely not, right? Unsubscribe from your brother-in-law's email newsletter. He's either not that good at math, or he's got a dog in the fight somehow, or just, I don't know what his agenda is, but there just really isn't the ingredients out there, even with all the uncertainty and caveats and scenarios, where these numbers drop back down to 3%. Right. So, barring an absolute worst case economic out of left field catastrophe, I just really don't see that materializing. We do see the market continuing to improve. This is our baseline forecast, 5-6% this year, another 7, 8, 9, 10 over the next couple of years as we kind of trend back towards those long-term norms. But this is a downgrade from where we were even just 6 months ago, right? If you look at our kind of long-term forecast, even with our baseline scenario on 3 years of continued growth, normal is still a long ways off, right? We're now forecasting in ranges too, just because of all the uncertainty. But the thing I want you to take away is that even in our better case, our worst case, absolute best case, no bumps in the road, continued ongoing acceleration, none of those result in you being able to throw it in cruise control, because 400,000 units, which is what we used to think was a normal year for transactions, is still a long ways off. So yes, moving in the right direction, but yes, also those, buyers and sellers are getting a lot of misinformation. They need your help more than ever to navigate this insanely uncertain and complex environment. Just the transaction itself is super complicated. Insurance issues, like a 5,000-page purchase agreement, all these crazy things that they got to grapple with. So they really need you now more than ever. But I think the flip side of that is it means that we've really got to step up our game, and bring it. And that to me is really the recipe for success, is to embrace that role as kind of the trusted advisor for those clients that are really confused and need that expert guidance. And I think if you do that, then even with all the challenges, sky's the limit. Remember, times of economic uncertainty are times that make residential real estate look really good. And it is always a great time to own as much real estate in California as you can. You just got to help folks see the forest for the trees. And again, I think if you do that, you will absolutely crush it. I so appreciate the opportunity to be here to speak with you today. I appreciate your time and attention. And I really enjoyed being able to be here.
Thank you. Thank you. I think we do have another question in the chat. And you guys, please, if you have any questions, to raise your hand. Oh, I think we already did that question. Yes. So do we have any questions from anybody? comments from Mr. Levine?
I have a question.
Yes.
Thank you so much for this, Jordan. I'm just curious, what are your thoughts on, or do you have suggestions for us as far as like the places like in Pasadena Altadena where the fires took place, like I own a property in Pasadena and I'm still getting calls every day, even though clearly says that my property is not available. But yet when I try to get investors to like purchase the ones that maybe have been burned down that people are selling now, they don't want anything to do with it. And so I'm just wondering, what do you suggest as far as us trying to help, as far as rebuild that area? And I mean, how would you suggest we go about it, or help? Or I'm just
Yeah, I mean, I think if investors are turning their nose up at that stuff, they're sleeping. I honestly think if you look at the tail of the tape, and we've done this a couple of times, and maybe that's a good idea for me to go make an infographic or something for you guys to show, but we've done analysis on this stuff in the past. Paradise, the Santa Rosa fires years ago, the Thomas fires, even in like North LA County a while ago. And what we've seen almost universally is that the impacts to supply are worse than the impacts to demand, right? You might have some people that go to Palos Verdes or something like that instead of Malibu, right, over the short run. But those people don't just disappear, and the things that made those areas desirable in the first place, or those places are still desirable. And so the demand comes back way faster than the supply. And the translation on that is that we see prices actually accelerate in those areas. They're like depressed for a minute, right? Because they're just the supply disappears and there's not a lot of transactions and people are scared off just because of the immediate kind of environmental aspects of being in a burned out area and stuff like that. But shortly thereafter, the demand comes right back and there's not enough homes anymore, right? Both because the people still, all those people with capital gains that don't want to sell, the long-term homeowner that doesn't want to sell, and now there's just physically less units there and you can't build them back fast enough, that you start seeing those areas appreciate even faster. So like as an investor, I'm thinking like, do I want to be invested in properties where the percentage increases in my value is the biggest or the smallest?
Yeah. Okay. And do you have any idea about based on the other places that have had fires, about how long that transition is? Is it 8 years, 10 years?
No. Like prices start like accelerating like the next year,
Oh,
like yeah, like the demand comes back, like the dust settles literally, and then like the next year people are back trying to buy whatever is available for sale, and those existing home prices start going right back up, which are the comps that you're going to use for your rebuilt property.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you so much.
You bet. Great question.
I have a
Any more
question,
questions?
Marvette. Hi.
Hi.
I was in and out, so I apologize if he covered this. But I noticed that on one of the charts, because of the interest rates being lower than what they are now, a lot of people are staying in their homes. They don't really have a big choice of what to do.
Correct.
But then on the other hand, you have the high interest rates where people are buying now. And if the wages and the income doesn't increase or catch up, do you see that having an impact on delinquencies and foreclosures?
I think the good news is we have underwritten all these loans, right? It's not 2004 or 5 again where we're not underwriting. So we do have a lot of people buying at these big giant $5,000+ a month mortgage payments, but they're being pretty heavily scrutinized on that, right? These are mostly conforming GSE backed loans, meaning that you got to fit in the box credit score wise, debt to income wise, loan to value wise. These are people that could honest to goodness afford these homes that they've bought. Now that's not enough people, right? We need to fix the affordability. So that's a bigger number of people, but it's not all these on the bubble, zero down, like, at the first whiff of issues are going to be out of those homes. And in fact, the delinquency rate still is sub 3%. So even with the people buying at higher rates, they bought homes that they qualified for that they had high credit scores on and money down and all of that, and they're keeping that going. So I think you'll let a lot of stuff go before you let that home go. Because even the people at 7%, right? You could dump the house at 7%, but price has already gone up 5, 7, 8, 9, depends on where you live. But the price is already higher than it was even if you just bought that house a year ago, right? So dumping it and going somewhere, that's just not a good finance. Like back in the day, you were zero down, you were in a 5-1 option arm. The house next door to drop 50% of value. You have no equity. We're a no recourse state. You could rent the house next door for half as much as your mortgage. None of those things are true this time around. And so that isn't, those strategic defaults and stuff like that, I think that's a bad financial decision for you now. And that's going to preclude it, right? People were just doing that because it was cheaper to do that than to eat the decline on your home value. Or at least they thought it was. Actually, I bet you a lot of those people are kicking themselves for not still owning that thing, which is worth a lot more today. But I think the incentive for that isn't even there this time around.
Thank you. Any more questions?
Another good question. You guys are impressing me. I love it.
So if you want to just give us
C.A.R.
Go ahead. Does somebody have a question?
No, I was agreeing, saying it's a great group. I go, of course they are, man. We're the best ones. because what time is it?
It's a great time to be a realtor.
It's
We gotta-
a
we gotta
great
teach
time to
Jordan
be a
this.
realtist.
We got to teach Jordan this one. We really do.
Well, hopefully I didn't screw this one up too bad, and you guys will have me back again. I know you guys work with my colleague DeAnthony all the time, but I
Yes.
love the opportunity to come back.
And we thank you so much for being on a wealth of information. Thank you so much, Mr. Jordan. And to all of my realtors family, you guys, thank you for being here. And you guys, we are here the second and fourth Wednesday of the month, our hour of power, to get you guys resources for your business. So please join us, you guys, every second and fourth Wednesday at noontime. Once again, Mr. Jordan, thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you, realtors family. Everybody be safe out there, please. Bye-bye.